When I picked up the phone that autumn afternoon to ask Max about the wedding date, I wasn't expecting the world to tilt on its axis. The autumn light was pouring through my kitchen window, that slanted afternoon light that makes everything look golden and nostalgic, and I remember thinking how beautiful the day was, how perfect it would be for a wedding. My hand was already reaching for my calendar, the good one with the cream-colored pages where I wrote down all the important family moments. I had circled the date weeks ago in red pencil, even though Max hadn't actually told me what it was yet. I just knew there would be a wedding. There had to be. He had been with Catherine for 3 years, and things seemed serious. Or at least, I thought they were serious. Looking back now, I realize I saw what I wanted to see, believed what I needed to believe, to make sense of the sacrifices I had been making all along. I had rehearsed conversations in my head about what I would wear, how I would help, what I might contribute to make their day special. I had even asked my sister Diana weeks earlier if she thought a pale pink dress would be appropriate, or if that was too attention-seeking. The phone rang twice before Catherine picked up, and her voice was different that day. Not warm, not the way it usually was when she spoke to me about the apartment or the latest emergency they needed help covering. Her voice was sharp, almost brittle, like glass that's about to crack. "Hi, Mom," she said, and I noticed she used that word. Mom. The way someone uses a weapon sometimes, with just the right amount of distance built into it. I asked her about the wedding, about the date, about whether she had decided on a venue. I kept my voice light, as though I didn't already know so much about their plans. There was a pause, and in that pause, I could hear the sound of traffic. Or maybe it was just the sound of my own heart, beating too fast, suddenly aware that something was wrong. "Oh, we actually got married yesterday," she said, and her voice had that smile in it, the kind of smile you can hear through a telephone line when someone is about to deliver news they know will hurt. It was just family. Very small, very intimate. We wanted it to be completely unpretentious. The words hung there in the air between us, suspended like something that refuses to fall. Just family, very small, intimate. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone receiver against my ear, feeling the blood drain from my face in a slow, methodical way that made me feel detached from my own body, as though I was watching myself from somewhere above. I was not family. I was the person who had been paying their rent for the last 3 years. I was the person who had filled their refrigerator when they called crying about an unexpected car repair. I was the person who had bought the dishes they ate from, the furniture they sat on, the very mattress they slept on. I was the person who had answered their calls at 2 a.m. when Catherine had a work crisis. But I was not family. Not the kind that got invited to a wedding, apparently. Catherine's voice continued, filling the silence I couldn't seem to break. She talked about how perfect it had been, how it was just her and Max and her parents and a few witnesses. She said the word witnesses, and I heard in it a kind of clinical coldness, as though they had just executed some legal requirement rather than celebrated a marriage. She talked about the flowers and the dress and the way everything had worked out exactly as they wanted it to. And I stood there, listening, still holding my calendar with the red circle on an empty date. I was aware of my own breathing, of the tightness in my chest, of a feeling like betrayal made physical. I had bought a dress for this wedding 3 weeks earlier, a pale pink dress, modest and elegant. The kind of dress you wear to your son's wedding when you want to look nice, but not steal any attention from the bride. It was hanging in my closet right now, still in its plastic bag from the dry cleaner. It cost me $190, money I didn't exactly have to spend. But I spent it anyway, because I wanted to look beautiful for this day, to feel like I was part of something important. I wanted to be in the photographs. I wanted to see Max's face when he saw me sitting in the front row, proud and loving and completely present in this moment that should have been mine too, the moment when my son took a vow before God or whatever he believed in, and I wasn't there to see it. The 3 years before that phone call had been a steady erosion of my savings and my sense of self, though I didn't fully understand that at the time. When Max first asked if I could help with rent, he had seemed almost embarrassed about it. We were sitting in my living room on a Sunday afternoon, and he kept shifting his weight, unable to meet my eyes directly. He was 28 years old then, married to Catherine for less than a year, and they were struggling financially in a way that seemed to genuinely distress him. Just for a few months, he said. Just until they both got settled into their new jobs, until they could build up some savings, until they could get back on their feet. He mentioned the amount almost apologetically, as if $500 a month was a burden he hated to place on me. So I said yes. I said yes, because he was my son, and I had raised him to believe that family helped family, that we took care of each other in times of need. I said yes because the rent was only $500 a month, and I had a pension, money that came in reliably every month. It seemed manageable. It seemed temporary. It seemed like the kind of thing a mother does when her child is struggling. But a few months turned into 6 months, and 6 months turned into a year, and somewhere along the way, the request stopped being a question and started being an assumption. I would receive a text message on the 10th of the month. Mom, can you transfer the money by the 15th? No, please. No, thank you. No acknowledgement that this was becoming a pattern rather than an emergency. And I would go to the bank and transfer it. No hesitation, no discussion about whether they might finally be able to cover it themselves. No suggestion that perhaps it was time they started being responsible for their own rent. Just a quiet transaction that I performed automatically, like breathing, like something my body had learned to do without asking permission from my mind. The rent wasn't the only thing. Of course, there were other emergencies, an endless parade of them. Catherine needed a new laptop for work after she spilled coffee on hers, so I helped pay for that, about $300. There was a leak in their apartment ceiling, and the landlord was asking for a repair deposit they didn't have. So I covered it. There was a wedding dress to buy when they decided to have a small ceremony, a honeymoon to go on, because they felt they deserved it after the stress of the wedding planning. Furniture to replace when Catherine decided the couch they had wasn't the right aesthetic, and she wanted something more modern. There were doctor's visits that weren't covered by insurance, car repairs that came up unexpectedly, new tires, a broken washing machine. There were credit card bills that they asked me to help with, explaining that they had overspent and needed just a little help getting back to zero. There were countless small things that added up to something very large, very quickly, a tide that came in so gradually that I didn't realize I was drowning until my head went under. I kept a mental tally at first, though I never mentioned it to anyone. Not to Diana, not to my friends from the church, not even to myself, out loud. I told myself I was just borrowing from my future, from the time when I would retire and want to travel, or just sit in peace without worrying about money. I imagined taking that cruise to Alaska that I had always talked about, or spending a month in Europe, visiting the places Robert and I had planned to go before he died. But the traveling never happened, and the peace never came, because there was always something else. Always another reason to give, another emergency, another need. My own needs became smaller and smaller, compressed down to almost nothing. I stopped buying clothes that weren't on sale, stopped replacing the things that wore out. I wore the same 3 sweaters for 2 winters in a row. I stopped going to restaurants with friends because I was always calculating in my head how much that lunch cost and how many hours of their problems my one afternoon out represented. I canceled a vacation I had been planning to visit my sister in Chicago because Max called 3 days before I was supposed to leave and said they were short on their rent. The airline wouldn't refund the ticket, and I had to watch that money disappear as well. I hung up the phone with Catherine that autumn day and immediately began calculating. How much had I given them in total? I didn't know exactly, but I knew it was significant. I knew it was more than I should have, more than was healthy. I knew it was eating away at the safety net I had built so carefully over decades of work. I just didn't know how much more until I actually sat down and did the math. It took me 3 days to gather all the bank statements, 3 days of pulling out old documents, finding transfer receipts in a manila folder I kept in my desk drawer, adding everything up on a piece of notebook paper, like I was some kind of accountant, trying to figure out where all the money had gone. $500 a month for rent, multiplied by 36 months. That was $18,000 right there. Just the rent, $18,000 of my life's work, converted into someone else's shelter. But there was also the food, the regular grocery runs, where I would buy things for their refrigerator, because Catherine had mentioned in passing that they didn't have money for groceries that week. I would spend $70, $80, sometimes $100 a time. Over 3 years, I went to the store for them maybe 30 times. That added up to something close to $2,500. Then there were the birthdays, the Christmas gifts, the random emergencies that seemed to multiply, the new mattress they needed because their old one sagged, the air conditioning unit that broke during a heat wave in August, and they asked me to help replace because they said they couldn't afford a repair bill. The car insurance Catherine forgot to pay that 1 month and needed me to cover so she wouldn't lose her policy. The wedding dress for their secret ceremony, which I only found out about after the fact. But I included the money I had been prepared to give toward the wedding anyway. The honeymoon in the Caribbean that I helped fund, without knowing that was where the money was going. By the time I finished adding everything up, the number was so large that I had to read it 3 times to make sure I hadn't made a mistake, that my old eyes weren't deceiving me. $33,400. That was what I had given to my son and his wife in 3 years. That was money from my retirement account. That was money that my late husband, Robert, had left to me specifically to live out my final years in comfort, in security, without the worry that had shadowed my entire life. That was my future, converted into their present, spent on a life I wasn't even allowed to be part of. I sat at my kitchen table with that number staring up at me from the page, my hand shaking slightly, and something shifted inside my chest, like tectonic plates moving. It wasn't anger at first, though anger would come later and would come in waves that almost frightened me. It was clarity, sharp and cold and merciless, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally see the whole picture at once. I suddenly understood, in a way I hadn't before, that I had been participating in my own erasure. I had been so focused on being needed that I had missed the moment when I stopped being wanted. The financial support had become a substitute for an actual relationship, a kind of payment plan for my own son's affection. The money was the only language they seemed to speak to me in, the only communication that mattered. When I had nothing left to give, what would I be worth to them? What would I be to Max if I wasn't useful? What would I mean to Catherine if I wasn't a source of funds? That realization sat with me for 2 days. 2 days of walking around my house, going through the motions of living, while something inside me was completely rearranging itself, like furniture being moved in rooms I didn't control. I looked at my life with new eyes that suddenly seemed to be seeing clearly for the first time in years. I looked at the pale pink dress still hanging in the closet on its plastic hanger, and instead of sadness, I felt anger, pure, hot anger that made my face flush and my hands clench into fists. I looked at my bank account, which had been carefully built up over decades of work, and I felt violated, as though someone had reached into my chest and stolen something vital. I looked at my future, which suddenly seemed very uncertain because I had given away so much of my security, given away the buffer, the W, as supposed to protect me in old age, and I felt something harden inside me, something that made me stand a little straighter, made my jaw set firm. It was a coldness that I recognized, because I had felt it once before, years ago, when Robert died, and I realized I had to be both parents to Max and couldn't afford to fall apart. I didn't make the decision immediately, though. I sat with it for another day. I made tea. I cleaned out my refrigerator. I called Diana and told her I had done the math, and she went quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying, "Oh, honey, oh my God." I organized my financial papers into neat piles on the kitchen table, looking at each transfer I had made, each one a little piece of my life given away. I made the decision on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesday is usually the day the bank statements come in. And I was looking at the upcoming transfer to Max, the $500 that was scheduled to go out in 2 days. Friday was the 15th, when the rent was due. And like clockwork, I would transfer it. But not this time. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, chai-e, getting cold beside me, steam rising off the surface in thin spirals, and I picked up the phone. The number was one I had called countless times, but today my hands were shaking as I dialed. I called my bank. I spoke to a manager, a woman named Mrs. Klein, who had been processing my transfers for the entire 3 years. She answered the phone and recognized my voice immediately. She probably helped dozens of people a day, but she remembered me. She knew exactly what I was calling about without me having to explain, which told me something about how regular these calls had become. "Mrs. Richter," she said carefully, "are you sure about this?" And I said yes. I was absolutely sure. My voice sounded stronger than I felt, more certain than I had any right to be. I canceled the automatic transfer. I saw her immediately. I canceled every standing order that was set up to send money to Max and Catherine. Every regular payment, every recurring transaction. It took about 5 minutes total. 5 minutes to undo 3 years of financial entanglement. I also requested something else. Something that took more courage than the cancellations. Something that felt almost hostile, even though it was just practical. I asked them to set up new security protocols on my account. I asked them to require my presence in person for any large withdrawals. I asked them to block access from anyone else, even family, even if that person had my bank account number or claimed to be authorized to act on my behalf. Mrs. Klein processed all of this quietly, her fingers typing on her computer. When she was done, she said something that made me cry for the first time since finding out about the wedding. She said, "I'm proud of you, Mrs. Richter." She didn't know my full story. She just knew what she had witnessed through all those transfers. the regular pattern of an older woman supporting younger people, and she understood that what I was doing was an act of self-preservation, a kind of taking back of my own life. I didn't tell Max or Catherine what I had done. I didn't send any email explaining myself, didn't make any announcement, didn't give any warning. I simply existed in the knowledge that the transfer wouldn't happen, and I waited. I went through my days normally, or as normally as I could manage when my heart was racing, and every time my phone rang, I tensed up, wondering if it was them already noticing, already panicking. I cleaned my house, I scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed. I went to the grocery store, and for the first time in 3 years, I only bought things that I wanted to eat. I got fresh vegetables, good cheese, a nice bottle of wine. I didn't calculate the cost in relation to rent payments or emergencies I might need to cover. I simply picked things up and put them in my cart and felt a small thrill of freedom with each item. I called my sister Diana in Chicago and told her everything, every detail of the betrayal and the realization and the decision I had made. I talked for almost an hour, and she listened without interrupting, just making small sounds of acknowledgement and understanding. When I finished, she said, "It's about damn time." Those were her exact words. No anger in them, just recognition and something like relief. She told me she had been watching this unfold for 3 years, watching me get smaller and smaller when we spoke on the phone, hearing my voice become more uncertain, more apologetic. She had been waiting for me to finally see it clearly, to finally understand that I was worth more than the money I could give. I also made another decision that week. I went to see a lawyer, not because I was planning to do anything drastic, not because I wanted to fight them or take them to court, but because I wanted to understand my options. I wanted to know what rights I had, what protections I could put in place. I wanted to be prepared for what came next. The lawyer, a woman named Miss Weber in her 50s, with kind but sharp eyes, looked at the numbers I had brought her, the printouts of my bank transfers, the calculations I had done, and made a low sound in her throat. "This is elder financial abuse," she said quietly, and the word elder made me flinch slightly, even as I knew it was technically accurate. Even though you're the one giving the money, not the other way around. The patterns here suggest systematic exploitation. They're using guilt, using the parent-child relationship to extract money that you can't afford to give. She explained to me that I could recover some of it if I wanted to, that I could sue them, that I could pursue this legally and potentially force them to repay me. "You have documentation," she said, tapping her pen on the papers. "You have a clear pattern of requests and transfers. We could make a case." But I didn't want any of that. I shook my head firmly. I just wanted them to understand what they had done. I just wanted them to feel the weight of their own ingratitude, the way I had felt it. That crushing sense of being used and then discarded. I wanted them to know what it felt like when the money stopped. I made the final decision to wait and see what happened. I closed my eyes on Thursday night, and I thought about what I wanted the next few weeks to look like. What I wanted to happen when Max and Catherine realized that the money had stopped. I wanted them to panic just a little bit, to get a taste of the uncertainty I had been living with. I wanted them to understand that they couldn't rely on me anymore, that I wasn't an infinite source. And most of all, I wanted to see what they would do when I was no longer useful, what they would reveal about themselves when their needs weren't being met. So I did nothing. I didn't send any announcement. I didn't call them to explain myself or give them time to prepare. I simply let Friday turn into Saturday, Saturday turn into Sunday, and waited for Sunday to turn into the week when the rent would be due. The silence I maintained felt powerful, like holding my breath before diving underwater. I went to the beauty salon on Wednesday, the one I hadn't visited in 2 years, because I was always saving money for them, pinching pennies to make sure there was enough to transfer when they called. I asked Magda, who has been cutting my hair for 15 years, for something different, a new cut, a color, something that made me feel alive again. She looked at me with surprise when I didn't immediately say, "Just a trim, nothing too expensive." She gave me a cut that made my face look younger, added some subtle highlights that caught the light. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. I went to get my nails done, something I had denied myself for so long that I wasn't even sure I remembered how to relax while someone worked on my hands. The young woman doing the manicure complimented my hands, said they had good bone structure, and I felt almost silly tearing up over a compliment about my hands. For the first time in 3 years, I spent money on myself without guilt, without the voice in my head telling me that I should be saving this for an emergency they might have, that I should be responsible, that I should sacrifice. That Friday night, I bought myself a nice dinner at a restaurant I had wanted to try for years, but had never gone to, because it was expensive, and that seemed selfish. I made a reservation for one, which felt both strange and wonderful, and I sat at a table by the window with a view of the street. I ordered the expensive fish, the kind that costs more than I used to spend on groceries for them in a week. I ordered a glass of wine, a nice Chardonnay, and I let myself actually taste it instead of just drinking it. I sat there alone, and I felt something like peace, something like coming home to myself after being lost for a very long time. The city lights twinkled outside, and I thought about Max and Catherine, about how they were probably still expecting the rent transfer, how in a few days, Hay would start calling, start explaining, start apologizing. But I didn't think about it with sadness. I thought about it with a kind of cold clarity. They had made their choice when they decided to exclude me from their wedding, and now I was making mine.